Okay, so I gotta get this guy in the air and get him up on rims, on blocks, and start getting him ready to take the transmission out. We gotta swap the transmission from this one to our 98. Okay, so I got it up on blocks. I'm gonna zip the front wheels off. The lug nuts on these are usually 19s, but I have 21s on this. So I'm gonna take these off with a 21mm. Okay, it's always good to put something down before you work. Tarp works really well for being on the ground and not having to worry about ants getting in your clothes or, you know, getting stung or anything. The real challenge here is I want to reuse the fluid that's in here, or possibly reuse it. I'm hoping I won't have to, but if push comes to shove, I'll have to. It's really not that old. It's got either genuine Honda fluid or Idemitsu in it, I don't remember. But yeah, I'm gonna try to capture that fluid, which is easier said than done, but hopefully I can make it happen. So this is the passenger side of the car. There's the drain bolt right there. And I've got to remove that, and hopefully I can get this jug there to be able to capture the fluid. So I'm hoping a gallon jug will be more than plenty. If it's stuck, I'll show you how to get it off of there. A 3/8 ratchet will fit that perfectly. That's what it's made for. Here I have a 3/8 ratchet. It fits right on here. So let's see if this works. Yep, okay, it wasn't stuck. The way that you deal with these if they're stuck is you put it on loosen, you take a sledgehammer and hook it into the back of the ratchet, and then you pop it like this, as hard as you can this way. Usually after a couple hits like this, it'll pop off. The hardest drain bolt that I've ever had to deal with, it took multiples of those, but it got it. If it's stuck, you don't have an impact, or this doesn't work, then that's what you do. I actually have a short of me struggling with that same drain bolt that I was just talking about too. Okay, so here's where things are gonna get interesting. I'm gonna try and catch this fluid into a bottle like an idiot. My plan B is I'm gonna grab a drain pan that's got contaminated fluid in it, and I'm gonna put it under here just in case it goes to hell. Okay, so I got a drain pan here, just in case things don't work out the way that they're supposed to, or the way I want them to. I've got a big old jug right here. Hopefully, I can pull this off. This is another reason why to use the tarp, so your mess isn't going into the grass and the earth. Okay, so far so good. This magnet is doing its job. It's got a glob of shit on it. So my idea here is if I have to reuse this, I'm gonna run it through a fuel filter first. Hopefully I can get some Idemitsu and put it in there. Idemitsu makes Honda's ATF, and it's the same shit. I've had a bottle of Idemitsu in my hand and a bottle of Honda transmission fluid. They look the same, they smell the same. Usually I can tell differences just off of the smell of the fluid. The only thing that smells and looks exactly like Honda ATF is Idemitsu, because Idemitsu makes their fluids. I've used Idemitsu and an Accord. It worked just the same as the genuine stuff when it's what I could afford. If you go to use Valvoline or anything else, you want to put an additive in it. Lube Guard makes an additive that works with that. Here's the magnet here. So it's done its job, because this was a transmission from the junkyard that was put in here. I knew there was going to be some dirty stuff in there because it, you know, hadn't been flushed or anything. So that's good. The magnet did its job. Okay, so I cleaned the magnet off. I'm going to stick this back to close it real quick. That way I can check and make sure my jug's not leaking, just in case, because I've had that happen where the jug will have a hole that I don't know about. It looks like we're safe. I'm going to continue to let this drain, because I'm going to need all the help I can get when I go to take this off. That way it's not heavier than it needs to be. Make sure I don't lose my washer off in there. Looks like I will not be using this fluid because every time I stick the magnet in there, I get shit out on it. Okay, so now that that's good, I'm gonna put drain bolt back in because it's down to a drip. There's gonna be fluid left in the gears here and there and in the torque converter. That's good. We'll go ahead and cap this off. So counting what came out in the jug, perfect. 3 quarts came out. So it's excluding the torque converter and the rest transmission. So that's the way it's supposed to be. Make sure to label your containers. I can't count how many times I didn't mark my containers and it bit me on the ass later. So now that our mess is wiped up, usually you have to move the exhaust downpipe because you have to take a reinforcement bracket off between the transmission and the engine. I left that off because I was servicing this car a lot. I really didn't notice a difference. The good thing is that since that's out of the way, which that was pretty easy, you just remove this downpipe and then you just zip it off. There's a torque converter cover plate right here on the bottom of the transmission. It's held on by tins. We take that off and then we take the bolts off of the torque converter. Basically going to remove that one, this one. So you've got a bolt here, here, and here. One thing to do when you get the plate off of there, look at the bottom inside and see if you see any fluid that's ran down and pulled up in the bottom. If there's any fluid that's been inside of it that drips down. If you notice, the fluid that's on here is on the very, very tip outside and there's no trails from the inside. That's a good thing because that means that whatever fluid was running onto the bottom of this was from the engine side and not the transmission side. That's a good thing if you're pulling a transmission because that means the transmission isn't leaking, it's the engine that's leaking. So usually the oil pan, but could be a rear main seal. That's a good thing to keep an eye on if you're pulling a transmission. So now we've got our torque converters here in between the transmission and the engine. These have 10mm bolts on them, so you want to take those out and you have to spin this to get them all. Sometimes you can do it by hand. Other times, a lot of people like to turn the crankshaft to turn it. I don't have that option right now because I took everything off of my timing side of the engine. A lot of times trying to loosen it will turn it enough, and then you can crack one loose and then loosen it and it'll turn, and then crack one loose aggressively. But if you turn it slowly, it'll turn the torque converter. So that's generally what I do. Ratcheting wrenches like the Pittsburghs or this gear wrench work beautifully for this. So I'm not sure if I can catch this on camera, but basically what I'm doing is I'll take a bolt out. So like there's one, and then let's say I need to turn it. I'll put the wrench on it and very, very lightly apply pressure. That'll turn the torque converter to where you can get to the next bolt. So we want to turn a little bit more, we can do that to the next one. And that'll get it over enough to where you can access these without having to have access to the crankshaft. Maybe you're trying to get a transmission out of a wrecked car, and that's not happening because you can't get to the crank to be able to turn it. This is how you could do it. Alright, and that has us disconnected. The torque converter moves freely of the flex plate now. The cover that goes on the shifter, which comes off with, I believe these are 12mm bolts. We take this off and then we can access where the shift linkage is. If you're wondering why I'm doing all the stuff on the bottom first, it's because it's very, very sunny outside and I would rather be under the car right now. So that's why I'm doing this in such a weird way. I think normally I would do everything, if I was like in a garage, I would do everything up top first. That's usually the way that I did things when I had a garage. Alright, cover come off. Up in this recess, you have your shifter cable here. You have a bolt that holds it in here. This normally has a tab that keeps that from going anywhere. You'll have to bend it out of the way to get to that. This one I've already knocked the tab off, so this should be obtainable. It's in fact a 10mm. We have a 10mm on the shift cable we'll have to remove. Alright, and you just pull that out. Make sure to put your bolt back in place so you don't lose it. And we're just going to tuck the shifter cable somewhere out of the way. If you were going to have to remove your exhaust, you have two 12mm nuts on the hanger back here. You have, I believe, several 14s up front on the downpipe. You have your oxygen sensor, of course. So now pretty much the only things left on the bottom would be to disconnect the CV axles, and we'll do that when we're ready to start undoing bolts to remove it. So now we can just go up top, we can disconnect a bunch of electronics and stuff, get all the small stuff done first, and then the big stuff done last when we go to heave ho. I'm just taking my time with this. So up top gets interesting. You don't have to remove your distributor to get this done. However, it seems to be the best spot to suspend the engine. If you do not have an engine crane, you can block up the bottom of the engine and it'll do just as good. If you do have an engine crane at your disposal, you can put the engine crane down, take off the distributor, and use the two outside distributor bolts to hook on to the engine crane with a chain, and then that way the engine crane holds the engine up for you. So I'm going to take the distributor off. You can label your spark plug wires if you need to. I'm real thorough about everything, and I know my firing orders, so I'm just going to take this all apart as is. Unplug the VTEC solenoid, unplug the distributor harness, and now we can take the bolts off the distributor. We got three, one on this side, one on the top, and one on the direct other side. When you remove the distributor, it's going to want to leak some oil out. If you can get a head plug from a D17 and pop it in there, it'll keep that from happening. I don't know where mine is right now, so we're just going to have to pull this out and stuff a rag down here, like so, to catch anything that comes out. We can set this to the side. We got several different electrical connectors. You got the fan sensor connector up here. You got the gauge temperature sender right here. Of course, your VTEC solenoid and your VTEC oil pressure switch. You've got another fan switch on the thermostat back here. When you've got your factory air cleaner, you'll have to take that off. I'll show that on the car that this transmission is going to, because it's got factory equipment. So I'm going to take that air cleaner off. The air cleaner. Everything we're not messing with can be kind of tucked back out of the way. I'm going to move the harness off the bracket that's on the starter. There's a couple of them. We're just going to unclip and move those. You can drain your cooling system and take off your hoses if you need to. You don't necessarily have to, but it is a whole hell of a lot easier to deal with. So on your starter, you have a signal wire that unplugs, and then you have a nut with the starter here. So we got a 12 on top of the starter here. That'll move that out of the way. You can put your nut back on the starter, that way you don't lose it. Okay, now the other electrical components on this is going to be all the shift solenoids and the stuff that's on the transmission. Okay, on top of your transmission you have two solenoids here. These are some shift solenoids. Can disconnect that there. Disconnect the harness from the bracket. On the bottom there's a couple of other solenoids. I think they're your torque converter lockup solenoids. They're on the very bottom. You want to disconnect those. So we're down here at the bottom of the transmission. There's two solenoids here. You've got an electrical connection here. So we'll remove that. All of these are pinch and pull. We got another one up here. It's another pinch and pull. And then there's another one over here that goes horizontal here. It comes off there. Now we got to get the harness situated so we can get it out of the way. So once you have everything done, the harness will kind of just like come up. So you can actually pull all of this out and around the coolant hose if it's still on the car. Now we can just flop it back over the engine and it's out of the way now. There's also a speed sensor on the back of the transmission that you'll need to unplug. That's also pinch and pull. There we go. So now that's out of the way. Okay, so now with all the electronics undone, I'm going to remove the starter. It's got 2 bolts, one on this side and one on the bottom left. A little bit harder to get to. Bolts on the starter are 14s. Got one here, and one down here. Now if you're ever at the junkyard looking for a good torque converter that's been replaced on a car because yours went out, you can take the starter off with 2 14s, and when you pull it out you can actually look down in the hole that shows where the torque converter is, and if it's bright blue, it's a replacement. And you can see the torque converter in there. If it's bright blue, that's a replacement, or like bright like gloss gray, you'll know if it's a replacement. You also have a ground strap on top of the transmission. You'll want to remove that with a 10mm. Now if you're like me and you're removing this on dirt, you're going to want to take this little bracket off because it's definitely going to hang up and try and break on you. So there's little tabs that you push and it should come out. So on the other side of the bracket, there's these tabs that you depress and then it pops off. So right now we've got our transmission fluid lines left, and we have our CV axles still on the transmission and everything mounting it to the engine in the car. I saved these steps for last. They're higher effort and they're, you know, once you open the transmission up, you're running on borrowed time until you can plug it or put it into a car. So I like to keep the transmission as closed as long as possible. Plus, if you're doing this at a junkyard and it takes you a little while, once you get to this step, you could come back the next morning and go ahead and rip it out of the car if you were trying to do that. We're going to go ahead and start on the CV axles. Up top we've got a 17. Lower ball joint's a 17. I think the tie rod's a 16. Yep, 16. There's multiple ways to pop a lower ball joint up. Personally, I like to use a dead ratchet or a long extension shoved underneath it on the lower control arm and then just punch it with a heavy fucking hammer. Seems to work pretty good every time. You can do it from either side, front or back. Even better from the front, because if you can take a 1/2 inch extension and stick it in there, you can get the actual knuckle of the extension in there. So when you hit it with a hammer, it pops it. Just like that. So now the lower ball joint's popped up and out of the hole. And you can now take the nut off and set it to the side. So if I can get this on camera, here's how it works. Your 1/2 inch extension in between the ball joint and the lower control arm here. Butt the back up against there, and then you come on this side and you hit it with a hammer and it makes the whole thing jump up and out of the hole. Right? So now we undo our tie rod nut, put it to the side. You can take a hammer. Most of the time you can just hit upward. It'll come right out. Might take you a couple hits, but you'll get it. On the control arm, you just loosen the nut. Take a hammer, give it a knock on the control arm, and it'll pop right up. Before we lift this up and off of here, you'll want to take your caliper off, and we'll take the nut for the CV axle off. I'll go ahead and do that now. These are usually 32, 34s, or 36s. It just depends on what you get. There we go. And we're going to take our caliper off. The caliper should be held on by two 12mm bolts. Right, and now we remove this bracket that's on the knuckle. It's two 10mm bolts. And we can slide the caliper out of the way. You'll want to hang this up. Generally a bungee cord or something will work. You can hook it onto the upper control arm and it'll keep it out of the way. I'm just going to hold that there. You can pull this up. This will literally all come apart now. You can pull the CV axle out of the back. Sometimes it gets a little stuck, so you give it a little back and forth, and you can push it out. And then once that's good, you lift up on the ball joint that you just broke loose, and then the whole knuckle comes off. Now we repeat on the other side, and then we remove the CV axles, and then we can get started on the transmission coming out. Removing the CV axles on these is pretty easy. To remove them from the transmission, you go to where they mate up with the transmission, and you want to take like a big flat head or a pry bar or like the tie iron that comes with the car, and you can put it right here, just flat up against the transmission, and push out. And you'll actually move the CV axle out of the transmission. And you can just keep pulling it and it will pop out. Works the same way with both sides. To get them completely out, you have to remove the lower control arm to strut, fork, bolt, and nut to get them out completely. Because if not, they'll hang up right there. So we'll do this side too. Put something flat there and push. And there you go. Once you have driver's CV axle out, you'll have these two bolts that go to the bracket, holds it to the rear motor mount. These two on this car are 19s. We got these two here. This one over here will be part of your support bracket. You'll take that bolt out. It's not existent right here. And then up here, there's another one that goes to the other side. Okay, I have my engine stand out here, supporting the weight of the engine on those distributor bolts right there. And I have the weight just lifted off the transmission. Just trying to get those two bracket bolts off the back, and they were so seized on there. Impact got one of them after hammering on it. This one I had to use the breaker bar and I had to use my foot. Here's how corroded that one bolt was the impact removed. Let me show you how I did it. So if it's at a right angle with the car, I had to lay on the passenger side, take my foot and put it on the bar and give it a shove like this at this angle, and that's what's been breaking it loose. Then you got to take it off, flip the socket 1 degree, put it back on there, and keep using your foot until you can use your hand. You can use your hand, you can use a ratchet or whatever you want to. Should be able to put this impact on there and zip it right off now. Yep. Alright. And that one was full of crud too. So that's how you get those unstuck. Now with the transmission bolts, I believe these are all 17s. So with these, you generally want to start on the bottom ones and work your way up to the top. Those two, skip these two top ones to be the last ones you take off. But just work up the sides. There's multiple bolts, you can't miss them. They're all the 17s that go around the bell of the transmission. Okay, so now I've removed all the bolts from around the transmission holding it on, except for the top two. Now we've got the actual motor mount here that holds the transmission, and we've got a torque mount here that holds the transmission. You can take this bolt out and these two nuts and just take the bracket off the transmission. Alright, you have to use a deep well on the nuts on the transmission. There we go. Don't worry if they come out with the studs attached, that's fine. That's workable, you can literally put them back in like they're bolts. So you can take the bracket off. Now we'll need to take a jack and support the transmission from underneath. Jack supporting the transmission there. Let's let the weight off the torque mount. You can remove the torque mount with a 19mm right there. And then we remove those, remove the cooling lines, and then we'll drop it out. I'm just going to remove these two 14mm and go ahead and take this off. I'm going to do those lines and these two bolts up here. Now these lines are real simple. It's literally just two clamps holding them on. They can be factory style pinch clamps you take off pliers, or replacement worm clamps with flatheads. Alright, those are undone. Now you got to shove the hoses off. Alright, there's one. I gotta get the other one off. I had a lot more fluid in it, and that's why I saved this to be one of the last things I do, is because it's gonna run everywhere and I'm gonna have to clean it up. Alright, now we got our two 17s left on the top of the transmission. Alright. I don't know if the camera got that, but it just separated from the engine. So that's cool. There it went. So I actually didn't even have to do anything for that. Well, shit, we can just drop it out now. Double check, always make sure all of your electronics are disconnected everywhere, including grounds. So, yeah, low effort. That just came right off. I didn't even have to struggle with the dowel pins. You can see the dowel pin right there. It just hopped out doing it this way. That's cool. Alright, so now I just wrestle it the hell out of there. And one thing I'm going to try to do is keep the torque converter from falling out of the transmission. I don't know how realistic that expectation is, but I'm going to try. I'm going to let it down real slow. Okay. There it is. A little more. Alright, now when it's down flat like this, we're actually pretty good. I'm just going to take my jack. I'm going to pull. And it's going to try and fall anyway. There it went. Okay, it went ahead and rolled off. That's good. I'm going to push it by the torque mount. Get that jack out. And it's out. Okay, so here's the transmission on the ground. Torque converter still in it. All good. Let's get this thing out of here. This is a B4RA, I believe.